Welcome to our third visit to Africa this winter. I like to remind myself that it might be 32 degrees in my backyard, but it's nice and warm in most of Africa right now. In the previous two lectures, we traced our origins in Africa, and we heard about the enormous challenges that their abundant natural resources pose for African nations. Tonight, we'll be discussing the event that probably resonates most strongly for us as Americans, and the one that so closely binds our histories, the histories of the U.S. and Africa together, the transatlantic slave trade. To help us understand what this means, we're fortunate indeed to have as our guide Mariana Candido, whose area of study is African history with an emphasis on the slave trade. She's focused her work on Angola. Professor Candido, a native of Brazil, completed her undergraduate work at the University of Rio de Janeiro. After a master's degree in Mexico, she leapfrogged to Canada, received her PhD from York University in Toronto. She taught for 2 years at the University of Wisconsin before joining Princeton's history department in 2008. For such a young scholar, she has an impressive list of publications, academic fellowships, grants, awards, and honors, all recognizing her work on the history of the African slave trade. When we were organizing this series, Professor Candido's name was on everyone's list of those we should include as a speaker. So we did. And tonight she's going to discuss with us Africa and the transatlantic slave trade, political, economic, and social transformations. Professor Candido.
Am I ready to go?
Turn yourself on.
I think I'm on. Am I? No? Is it okay now? Well, thank you for such a lovely introduction. And I'm sorry that I'll be competing with the president tonight, but it's such an honor. So today I will talk about the transatlantic slave trade and the changes that it created in the African continent. So we'll talk about the numbers. But more than the numbers, I'm interested in what happened in Africa when so many people left the African continent in a short period of time. So we'll start with the European expansion and the first contacts with Africans in the beginning of the 15th century, and we'll go all the way to the end of the 19th century. So we are basically covering, no? Oh, it's an echo.
She's not using this one.
Oh, maybe I have to. Is it better now? Well, so we are going to start with the beginning of the 15th century. And we'll go all the way to the end of the 19th century. So we are going to cover 400 years of history in 50 minutes. We can do it. And please, if you cannot hear me, let me know before I get too excited and I talk too much. So the European experience with waterborne travel was probably the most significant factor that allowed the Europeans to conquer the Atlantic. A series of motivations existed, including a long battle with Muslim populations in the Iberian Peninsula that went back to the Reconquista in the 14th century in Portugal. Can't you hear me?
Look up. If you look down, we can hear you.
Oh, so I cannot look at you. So I apologize. I will be facing down. Maybe I can move like that. Let's try again. So all the economic possibilities that might provide reasons for the Atlantic navigations, the most probably and the most prospect one was the short route to the West African gold fields. West Africa had been a source of gold for the Mediterranean territories for centuries, perhaps since Roman times. Europeans knew about gold fields in Africa. They didn't know exactly where in the African continent. Muslim writers since the 9th century were aware on the gold producing areas. This is a map from the 14th century produced by a Muslim scholar from Andalusia. Can you hear me? No, I'm paranoid.
It's like the scene in Singing in the Rain when the actor speaks into the mic and then turns away.
Okay, so I will have to look down. This is a map from the 14th century produced by a Muslim scholar showing West Africa. This will be difficult to look down and use the pointer. West Africa and Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali, and he has on his hand a nugget of gold. So this map from the 15th century shows the knowledge that Arab scholars have about the gold fields in the African continent. So one of the motivations that most scholars don't address is the fact that the Portuguese, in the case, the leading Europeans conquering the oceans, they had a goal to get to the source of gold in West Africa, and in this way break the Muslim control of gold trade in the African continent. So the Portuguese start sailing along West Africa in the early 15th century, trying to reach the source of gold. Some of these expeditions brought back commodities such as oils and skins, but also some slaves. Portuguese repeated the practice of raiding and enslaving people as they had already done in North Africa. In 1442, 2 Portuguese captains returned from West Africa coast with gold, salt, and 10 slaves. And this is the first record slave trade operation between the African continent and Portugal in 1442. The Portuguese expeditions rarely venture further along the coast. So the actual motivation for European expansion and for navigation along the Atlantic was little more than to exploit the opportunities for immediate profit made by raiding and snatching people along the coast of Africa. In this map, you can see several Portuguese expeditions reaching different parts of West Africa, and with the name of the Portuguese explorer in each one of them. Gold was available from many points along the coast, and sailors expanded rapidly southward until they reached the coast of modern Sierra Leone. In the map. And the Portuguese arrived in Sierra Leone around 1460s. Shortly afterwards, a Portuguese sailor named Gomes reached the gold-producing region of the Gold Coast, where is modern Ghana. So this is a map of Gold Coast. It is from 1729, so it's not exactly from the time period that we are covering right now. So when the Portuguese arrived at the Gold Coast, they finally got the gold they were looking for, and they established trade relationships with Akan people living in this region. So the Akan, instead of bringing or selling the gold they were producing to Muslim traders who would then cross the Sahara with this gold and sell them to other traders in North Africa, and eventually this would reach the southern Mediterranean, they end up changing the route of the gold trade, bringing gold to the coast and selling this gold to the Portuguese. It was so profitable that the Portuguese crown decided to build a castle, a fortress along the coast, and it was named São Jorge da Mina in the end of the 15th century. As a result of these expeditions, the Portuguese decided to sponsor another expedition sailing along the coast of Africa, and they finally arrived in Congo in 1482. So this is before Columbus arrived in the Americas. In the first attempt, the Europeans were simply kidnapping people along the coast of Africa. But they had little success with these attacks on mainland. Raiding was a very limited option because they realized that after raiding once and kidnapping people, they couldn't go back to the same region. So the Portuguese eventually gave up kidnapping as a tactic to get slaves, and they decided to establish trade relationships with African rulers. The first one they contact is the ruler of Akan, who had already sold gold to the Portuguese. So the Portuguese crown starts sending explorers to different parts of African coast to negotiate treaties of peace and commerce with African rulers. As a result, Portugal established diplomatic relationships with different African states. When the Portuguese arrived in Banza, Congo, the capital of the Kingdom of Congo, sorry, I'll have to look. Oh, here. So Banza, Congo was the capital of the Kingdom of Congo in West Central Africa, where is Angola nowadays. They found what they were looking for, a state with a surplus of captives. Congo was an expansionist state. So the ruler of Congo was conquering land, raiding different villages, capturing people, and enslaving captives of war. Facing a surplus of captives, the ruler, Nzinga Nkumu, had no problem selling them to the Portuguese. In the end, they were captives of war. The Portuguese offered alcohol, gunpowder, weapons, and textiles. Africa trade with Europe was largely motivated by prestige, fancy, and desire for variety, not by a real need. In Africa, people produce alcohol and textiles. So the Portuguese started to transport Congolese captives, recently acquired in Congo, to the Gold Coast, and exchange them for gold. Some of these slaves brought from Congo stayed at the Mina Castle. Some were sold to the Akan, and they worked in the interior as porters. Some end up in the gold mines. Eventually, some slaves were also transported to Portugal and to the Atlantic Islands to complement labor in the developing sugar plantations. This is by the end of the 15th century, so before the Americas. So we know that slavery existed in Africa before the contact with the Portuguese. But who could be a slave? Anyone who was an outsider. There was no sense of belonging to the African continent or seeing skin color as a unifier. African rulers saw their enemies, people defeated in a war zone, people who spoke different languages, worshiped different gods, came from different cultures. In only few cases, African rulers sold insiders, criminals, in this case they were criminals or political enemies. There is no evidence of an African ruler selling an insider, except in the case of criminals and political enemies. So the slave trade in the 16th century was controlled by the Portuguese. They start by moving people along the coast of Africa, and with the development of colonies in the Americas, in the whole continent, the Portuguese started to supply African labor to the mines, especially in South America in the 16th century. The first record use of African slave labor in Spanish America was in 1502, so a few years after the Europeans arrived in the New World. Later on, by the end of the 16th century, African labor started to be employed in sugar plantations in Brazil. In the 16th century, stimulated by the profits of sugar exports to Europe, the Portuguese crown imported sugar cane from the Atlantic islands of Madeira and São Tomé along the African coast and established sugar plantations in the Brazilian coast. The Portuguese used Amerindian labor, and they also tried to use Portuguese slave labor, prisoners, people who were arrested, who had committed a crime, outlaws. But then the sense that Europeans could not be enslaved was extremely strong in Portugal. So knowing that they could get a supply of slaves from the Congo, the Portuguese started crossing the Atlantic, bring people from West Central Africa to the Americas. The slave trade seemed to be very profitable for the Portuguese. And the increasing wealth of the Portuguese monarchy attracted the attention of the Dutch, the English, and the French. So slavery existed in Africa as it existed in different parts of the world. But the arrival of Europeans changed its nature. Until the 17th century, most of the slave trade was in the hands of Portuguese merchants, but it was too profitable to stay in few hands. The Dutch, English, and French joined the trade, trying to establish trade fortresses along the coast of Africa to break the Portuguese monopoly. The presence of Europeans along the coast created demand for slaves that no African state could supply. More wars had to be created to attend the European demand. The constant level of warfare created permanent sense of insecurity and political instability. So this is a map of the African continent with the 8 major regions from where people were deported from the African continent. The reason why I'm showing this map is that in a minute I will show a table where we are going to explore some of the numbers of the transatlantic slave trade. And I want you to recognize these places and be able to put these places in a map. So I will show the places here. So as you can read, Senegambia, between the rivers Senegal and Gambia. Then we have Sierra Leone that you will not see in the table. So I'm just warning you. Then we have the Gold Coast, so the region that was reached by the Portuguese in the end of the 15th century, where the gold trade started, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, West Central Africa, and Southeast Africa that becomes important in the transatlantic slave trade only in the 19th century. In this table, you get a sense of the volume of people transported to the Americas. It's breakdown by region of origin, and this is the place where people embarked. So we don't know exactly if it corresponds to the place where people were from, but this is where they were embarked, and also by period of time. The reason why we know the volume of the transatlantic slave trade is because it was a legal business. People paid taxes. Slave traders had insurance. So we know how many people were transported. But we also know that not everybody paid taxes because we know how things work. So this is a minimum number. So what we know, and this was a major project organized by people around the world to collect data on slave ships. was involved. It was a major enterprise covering archives in different languages, in different continents. And the number that we have right now is 12 million people, 12,500,000 people. This is a minimum, and I want you to keep this in mind. This is what we know. It doesn't mean that it is a huge number. 12 million people cross the Atlantic. We can assume that it's a number larger than that. But what the study offered to us is an idea about time variation and also place of origin. So we know that most people left the African continent during the 18th century. It's more than 6 million people in 100 years. And we know that most people left from West Central Africa, over 5 million people. So what we know is the transatlantic slave trade was an extremely concentrated business. And this is important to realize the kind of cultural background people brought to the Americas, but also to understand the consequence of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa. You can also see in this table that the 19th century is a short century in the sense that it finished in 1865. But it's almost 4 million people who crossed the Atlantic in the 19th century. The British had abolished the slave trade in 1808, but the Portuguese only abolished the trade in 1836. But it didn't bring the slave trade to an end. Brazil and Cuba continued to import African slaves until 1865, when most ports were already closed in the Americas. We also see concentrations in terms of place of origin. So Bight of Benin exported almost 2 million people. It's a small region in the map. The Bight of Benin. The Bight of Biafra, a huge number as well, over 1 million people. But what is impressive is the number of almost 6 million people from West Central Africa. During this rapid expansion of the Atlantic slave trade in the 18th century, military hardware, especially muskets, became the principal article of trade in the African coast. In the 18th century, the annual average import of guns was around 350,000. More guns encouraged more warfare. More warfare led to more captives. The Europeans not only brought weapons to Africa, but they also brought diseases. The Portuguese, the English, the French carried the diseases of the old world that were to infect the peoples of Africa. As early as the 1560, smallpox epidemic was reported in Congo. And during subsequent centuries, epidemics erupt, usually during periods of severe drought. Other diseases introduced by Europeans included typhus, tuberculosis, and syphilis. Ironically, the arrival of Europeans introduced new world crops of great productivity, such as corn and manioc, that is still the main staple in different parts of the continent. The slave trade was facilitated by the cooperation in the interests of some African elites. In the case of Congo, the relationship with the Portuguese was established in order to obtain external products. Within few decades, the Mani Congo, the ruler of Congo, converted to Christianity and initiated a trade of local slaves, copper and ivory. In exchange, he got missionaries, technicians, and alcohol supplied by the Portuguese. What is interesting is that the king of Congo he wanted carpenters. And he sent several letters to the Portuguese king requesting carpenters. The reason why he wanted carpenters is because he wanted to build a boat, a slave ship. So he would be able to trade people rather than selling them to the Portuguese. The Portuguese, of course, never sent the carpenters that the King of Congo requested. The problem is that the Portuguese could not get enough captives from the official markets established by the King of Congo, and they end up kidnapping Congolese subjects of the money Congo. The constant enslavement of Congo's subjects created a series of internal problems. The money Congo wanted to monopolize the processes of enslavement as well as the market. And he also realized that if his people started to be captured, you create internal problems. His people started to revolt, claiming that he was unable to protect them. So what we see in Congo during the 17th century, at the same time that we have an expansion of the slave trade and more African slaves arriving in Brazil, is a series of revolts in Congo of people who felt they were not protected by the ruler. So people complain about the behavior of the Portuguese, and the money Congo sent a letter to the King of Portugal. But first I want to show you the capital of Congo, Mbanza, Congo, in the late 17th century, in this image. And this, I love this image that shows the money Congo in the center receiving Dutch ambassadors when he's trying to renegotiate the slave trade, and the Dutch ambassadors are kneeling in front of the King of Congo. And I think this image captures the relationship that existed there. So in 1526, the King of Congo sent this letter to the King of Portugal. They, and by they means the Portuguese traders, seized numbers of our free black subjects, and even nobles, sons of nobles, even the members of our own family. And with this, the money Congo expelled the Portuguese from his lands because he was not willing to trade with people who didn't respect the terms of trade. So the Congo market was closed to the Portuguese, who were forced to move south and settle in Luanda. That you don't have in this map, which is surprising, but it's here. So the Portuguese settled in Luanda, and Luanda became one of the most important ports of slave trade. So the Portuguese capture people, they buy people from African traders, but they also kidnapped several people around Luanda. So although the Congo Kingdom continued to exist after the expulsion of the Portuguese, its power and prestige diminished with the loss of the monopoly of trade with the Portuguese. But the King of Congo was not the only one to resist the slave trade. We also know that the ruler of Benin, in the Bight of Benin, as you can see there, prohibits the sale of male slaves to Europeans. He realized he needed extra men to protect and defend his state, so he was not willing to give up captives of war to the Europeans. So he preferred to save these people locally. In response to the transatlantic slave trade, Africans developed new forms of political and social organization. But the skills and equipment that made possible the transatlantic slave trade accelerated the growing technological gap between Africa and Europe. The demand for slaves increased the institution of slavery in Africa. It contributed to the disruption of traditional culture and confirmed the growth of disregard for human life as persons became property. The brutality that followed the capture, enslavement, and the transportation across the Atlantic of Africans produced a great misery that cannot be ignored. The capture of slaves to supply the Atlantic slave trade generated death and migration among the population who stayed in Africa. In West Central Africa, the deportation of more than 5 million people in 4 centuries led to depopulation and political and social reconfiguration. Scholars calculate that 100,000 people were displaced each year by the end of the 18th century in consequence of raids, wars, and instability. So there was a constant movement of people in West Central Africa for 400 years. The European demand for male slave labor left a high number of enslaved women locally. These enslaved women remained in the region, but they were still enslaved. So some of them were able to reproduce and contributed to the natural reposition of the population. But it also means that different societies shift toward an increasing practice of polygamous marriages because there are fewer men. So there is a higher number of children per male adult to maintain the population level. So it seems that polygamy in this region is a result of the transatlantic slave trade. What is curious about the transatlantic slave trade is that both African and Portuguese authorities sanctioned enslavement through legal, justified wars. Although some forms of warfare were recognized as legitimate, so it was okay to enslave people in warfare, both Africans and Portuguese authorities recognized that kidnapping and trickery or banditry were illegal means of enslavement. And it's curious to see in the documents exactly these terms being used. This person was captured in a legal way or in an illegal way. Raids generated not only stability, but also caused reactions and punitive attacks by different groups. So in these events, it is pointless to search for villains and victims in the African continent. Rulers who were raided eventually raided as well as a way to protect his own people. So positions shift according to military conditions and strategic associations, sometimes associations with Europeans. But women, children, and anyone debilitated by a physical condition, such as injuries or malnourishment, were vulnerable to anybody with superior physical power in war or in kidnapping. But what is curious is that the existence of different mechanisms allows societies to participate in different levels in the Atlantic slave trade. And it's through these different mechanisms, such as kidnapping, that most of the male slaves were generated. Warfare, and we have several accounts that report there, warfare end up with a large number of women, children, and old people captured. New states emerged in the African continent, such as the state of Oyo in the interior of the Bight of Biafra and Kassange in West Central Africa, with a strong emphasis on raiding. So these states were based on power and violence. They were able to capture more people. And because they were so powerful, they were able to protect more people who were suddenly powerless. So they offer protection to people affected by previous raids. In exchange, these new migrants produce new weapons and join the military forces to attack other villages and enslave more people. What we see is that the economic basis of these new states was the transatlantic slave trade. In terms of economic production, we also know that people gave up agriculture to engage in slave trading. It was more profitable to kidnap people, to engage in warfare and capture more people, than to produce food, to clear the land or cultivate. It was easier to buy food from the Europeans than to produce food. What it created is a long-term problem. People buy food in a moment, but eventually they become dependent on the food brought by Europeans. So what we see with the transatlantic slave trade is a total inversion of economic and political values in the region. There is no doubt that the Atlantic slave trade was a major event in the history of Africa. It reshaped the political, economic, and social organization. And it favored the emergence of some states, such as Oyo and Kasanji, and contributed to the decline of others, such as the Congo Kingdom. It spread the state of violence. Slaves were acquired through violent strategies, such as raids and warfare. The propagation of violence led to political instability, but it also contributed to the emergence of the big man authority who could offer security to unprotected people. Millions of Africans were enslaved and forcibly moved to the Americas. If it is possible to estimate that at least 12 million people arrived in the Americas, it is difficult to calculate the number of victims who died in Africa during the enslavement processes, or the people who died in the long walk from the interior to the coast, or even the people who died during the Atlantic crossing. If we know that 12 million people arrived in the Americas, we can assume that at least a number equal to 12 million people died in Africa. It is a huge demographic loss in 400 years. Some African rulers, sold their enemies to the Europeans in exchange for alcohol, guns, and textiles. None of these goods brought advantage to the development of African societies. The textiles were lost and rotten after some decades. The alcohol was consumed, and the guns increased the production of captives. At the same time, Africans and their descendants were forced to work in plantations or in urban centers in the Americas, producing wealth which they could not have access, and which was later exchanged for more African slaves along the African coast. I will stop here and wait for questions. Thank you. Look at me.
Great. Questions?
Okay.
You start with the 15th century, but prior to the 15th century, how pervasive was slavery within Africa and for how long?
We know that slavery existed in different parts of the African continent. The problem is always the lack of historical documents. So for some regions of the continent that had a long history of contact with the outside world, so let's say West Africa, East Africa, North Africa, we do have documents in Arabic mentioning the existence of slaves. But again, even if slavery existed in the continent, the transatlantic slave trade changed. It changed completely the institution. Yes?
At what point did African countries outlaw slavery?
Sorry?
At what point did African countries outlaw slavery?
It's interesting because when the British abolished the slave trade in 1808, there are several reports of African rulers in the interior of the Bight of Benin complaining about that. When the Portuguese also abolished the slave trade, there are several reports of rulers from the interior of Angola sending letters and saying, if you don't want to buy our slaves, let us sell them to the French or to the Dutch. The Dutch were not involved in the slave trade anymore, but there was this idea that it was possible to sell to the Dutch. Again, this was the source of income for different states and for different people. So it is quite confusing to explain why in one time the British were so involved in the slave trade and suddenly, in less than 10 years, they want to abolish.
I have a comment and two questions that you were talking about. You mentioned that people were slaves
Yeah.
And it's about just a little bit bigger than Fresno, California. Now in that area, right now there are about 250 ethnic groups with different languages. So that area as a whole is one with a lot of different and ethnic groups. This will explain the ease with which we could just, go 2 miles down the road and capture people from totally different peoples that wouldn't speak the language. First question, what are the differences in the treatment of slaves in Africa and what they were brought to? Because as far as I know, slaves could be integrated in society, they were married, they didn't have language in their lives as they were in, well,
In the Americas?
US or Brazil and so on. That's the first question. First about that. And secondly, is it also a consequence of slavery that people began scarification or changing their outward appearance to avoid being captured for slavery?
Thank you. Thank you for your clarification. This is extremely important. And we have this idea that people in Africa have a sense of unity, that we are Africans, and this is a 20th century creation. In the same way that no one in North America has a sense of belonging to North America and fighting for the rights of Canadians or Mexicans, the same thing doesn't happen in the African continent, especially before colonialism. About local slavery, slavery did exist. It is different from chattel slavery in the Americas. There is no doubt about it. There were different ways how people could be integrated, but there is also a stigma that doesn't go away. Everybody knows who is a descendant of a slave. People could marry with a free person. There was no prohibition, but there is also, the stigma is present. There were physical violence in certain places, and it's very difficult to generalize about slavery in Africa because it's North Africa, in areas with Islamic law, it's quite different from West Central Africa, for example. But slavery is slavery, and people were oppressed. They were not able to control their bodies and their lives. About scarifications, there is a hot debate right now about scarifications and in what way scarifications protect people. It seems that in certain parts of what is nowadays Nigeria, this happened. Some people would mark their faces in a way to show that they had closer contacts with the English, so they would be protected from the transatlantic slave trade. In other parts, scarification was done when people become slaves. So they have a body mark in the same way that the Portuguese would brand people living West Central Africa. Other Europeans in West Africa would use scarification to mark people. So again, it's difficult to generalize. So in some cases, protect people, but in other places, make them more vulnerable, so anyone can recognize a slave. Yes?
Why weren't North Africa and South Africa involved in the slave trade?
Why weren't they?
Why weren't North Africa and particularly South Africa part of the slave trade?
North Africa, there is a long history of contact with the southern Mediterranean, southern Europe. In North Africa, Islam defines who can be enslaved or not. So we don't have local people in North Africa being enslaved, and so to the transatlantic slave trade. But then we have the trans-Saharan trade bringing people from sub-Saharan Africa into North Africa. So slavery existed, but it protected Muslims.
In South Africa?
In South Africa, it was involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but the number of people exported from what is nowadays South Africa was very small. South Africa, the Cape Town, the Cape Colony region, ended up importing people from other parts of the African continent, mainly from Mozambique. With the expansion of the Dutch and later on the English colony, there was a need for labor after they massacred the local population. So people from Mozambique, where is nowadays Mozambique, were brought to replace the local population. That's why They never export people.
Does slavery exist today in Africa?
It does. Mauritania is an example. Sudan is another example. And we do have the same kind of excuses, religion being used to enslave people. So it's again the idea of insider and outsider. It protects some people, but it makes other people vulnerable, and they can be enslaved. And it's still a stigma in different parts of the African continent. In North Africa, this is very visible. People who claim links with sub-Saharan Africa are still discriminated, have no political rights, lived not in the major part of towns, they live around the villages, and they are not recognized in the national histories. There was someone here. Yes?
Well, I have more, I'm just so pleased to have someone talk about the effect of the slave trade on Africa. I had not thought about that, and we're not taught that in schools.
I know.
Very interesting.
But it says a lot about how we, in the western side of the Atlantic, we only think about our problems, and we don't think that it created a series of changes. We can imagine the consequences of Angola. It is a big country, but can you imagine a territory losing 5 million people in 400 years? And it's always young, healthy men living. So how can you give up your young population, your youth and healthy people who end up producing more goods and protecting other people? And you left behind children and old people who cannot be protected. Yes.
Any idea of what percentage of the population of those countries this was? Or is that not something we can know?
We don't, because we don't have censuses from earlier periods, so we don't know the percentage of people who are captured. But there are reports from different travelers who visit West Central Africa, for example, in the 19th century, and they report empty lands, villages where there is no one. And in the Portuguese, because I work with the Portuguese documents, and there are different reports of different rulers asking the Portuguese for protection because they cannot protect their own people. And what is the challenge is to understand the political history of this place, because it's very clear that you have a state, and 10 years afterwards, you cannot find the state anywhere. So what happened? Well, these people were captured. And they some people end up in the Americas, most people were killed, and others simply, they had to look for another person to protect them. Yes?
During these 400 years, were there any countries that stood out, that spoke out against slavery, or were there any movements
In Africa?
world,
In the world?
in other parts of the world, like European countries or Asian countries? Or
No.
There was no.
No, even when we have the abolitionist movement in Britain by the end of the 18th century, it's a marginal movement. It doesn't get much attention. It only becomes important at the beginning of the 19th century, especially after Equiano published his novels, and he talks about the transatlantic slave trade as a victim of the slave trade. And I always mention that the abolitionists, they were discussing the end of the slave trade, drinking coffee with sugar produced by slave labor in the Americas. And enjoying it.
There were no religions that spoke out against it.
There were certain Catholic groups in certain moments. But the Catholic Church was much more concerned with Amerindian labor in the Americas, protecting the local population of the Americas than the African population. Although some people were Catholics in Africa. Yes?
That begs the question, and I asked a question earlier on the outset of the 15th century coming in, but what were the primary reasons for the abolition
In the 19th century.
in the 19th century?
How much time do I have? This, again, there is an interesting debate going on right now. Some people say that it's capitalism that creates a demand for free labor. So it's cheaper to pay a salary and exploit people than to buy slaves in Africa. Other people will say that it's an independence of the colonies in the Americas that create the abolitionist movement in England or in Great Britain. So people in Great Britain trying to show that they are not associated with what is going on in the Americas. We lost the colonies, but they have slavery. And we are so great that we will fight against slavery. The interesting thing is that the Portuguese, no one in the Spanish crown discussed the abolition of slavery. It was an imposition by Great Britain. So there was no internal movement in Portugal or in Brazil or in Spain or in Cuba, you named, any of the colonies, to bring the slave trade to an end. There was a question in the back that I've been neglecting, so I apologize.
I was wondering if you had an idea of the split between North and South America and the destination of North America.
I do, because of the transatlantic slave trade. I was not, this transatlantic slave trade database is available online, so if you Google slave voyages, I think, you will find access. It's open access. Anyone can use the database and play with the database. It's extremely useful and easy. And you can see the places where people embarked and where they disembarked in the Americas. Most people who arrived in the Americas end up in Brazil. It's 40% of the total population of Africans. Then 30% in the Caribbean. The number of Africans who arrived in what is nowadays the United States is 10%. But there is a tricky problem there. Most Africans who end up as slaves in the United States, they didn't come straight from Africa. They come from the Caribbean. So they disappear in the transatlantic slave trade database. So the sense that, oh, it's only 10% of the transatlantic slave trade. It's not really only 10%. 10% is a lot when we are talking about 12 million people. But there is also an internal trade in the Americans from the Caribbean, from Jamaica, Barbados, to what is nowadays the United States. But most people end up in what is nowadays Brazil. Okay, sorry.
You related the volume of slavery to the geography. How does it relate to the territory? Like, did the Portuguese export more slaves?
Yes, they did. Later, the British, the British, and then the French coming third, then the Dutch.
Why is the windward closed? You didn't mention that.
Well, the reason why I don't mention, well, they are in the other, in the table. They get there. Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and the Windward Coast are the other Africa in the table. And the reason is just because their number is smaller than other regions, and the Windward Coast does not exist as a concept in Africa. This is a creation of people looking from this side of the Atlantic. No. It is grouped in the Windward Coast, but there is no sense in the African continent that this exists, and most people did not necessarily live from there. They live, they are diverted to the Bight of Benin, to the Gold Coast, also to Senegambia. The reason why I say that, because it was not easy to embark people there. That's why the numbers are small. So I don't want to get this sense that no one left from there. And again, these are only the places where people are embarked. It doesn't mean that people are from this region. Yes?
Where did the East African slaves go to?
The East Africa slave trade is a different trade route. It's basically a trade route in the Indian Ocean. So most of the people from what is nowadays the Swahili coast, and we are talking about another 10 million people in that region, they end up where is nowadays the Arabian Peninsula, India, China. So there was a slave trade also in the other side, but it's not in the Atlantic, in the Indian Ocean. There is also a trans-Saharan trade of people being exported, mainly from West Africa to North Africa, and then joining the Muslim world. Yes?
Is there any documentation of revolts among the slaves? And also, is there any documentation from the slaves of their experience?
In Africa, revolts in Africa. In different places, yes, it was much easier to revolt in the coast of Africa than waiting to be embarked, although there are some revolts along the coast before, already on board of slave ships. Senegambia, let me go back to the map. Senegambia, the highest concentration of revolts on board of slave ships in the coast of Africa took place in Senegambia. Senegambia is in the interior of Senegambia. Most people who are captured were captured in wars. This is a moment of jihad, Muslim states raiding other Muslim states and claiming that people were not real Muslims and enslaving them. And since most of these people were soldiers, they used their knowledge and they revolt and killed the crew along the coast. In Angola, there are different reports of runaway slaves and some revolts. But it's extremely difficult to know what happens in the interior of Africa because of lack of documents. We do have very good documentation, but it's only for the coast of the continent, not the interior.
Was there anyone who wrote and kept what the slaves' experience was from their point of view, the way we've had it in this country?
Not exactly the kind of memoirs that we can find in what happened in the what is nowadays the United States is unique. There is no kind of slave narratives in other parts of the Caribbean or in Brazil, for example. So it's something that happened in the U.S. and has to be studied, and people have to explore why it happens here and what is the role of missionaries in this kind of recollection of this memory. But in Africa, we have different moments. People who write petitions, and I'm exactly working on that on the case of a woman who was captured, and she's a subject of the King of Portugal. She's Catholic, she was baptized, she has a Christian name. So she, after being captured, when the priest, the Catholic priest, was ready to brand her in Luanda, she says that she's illegally enslaved. She's a Christian, she cannot be a slave. And then you have a court case. She didn't write down anything, but it's her voice there. She's the one claiming that she's a free person. So it's not exactly a slave narrative, but we have the voice of someone who was enslaved. Yes?
Is it true that Amazing Grace was written by a slave trader and did he become part of the abolitionist movement?
Yes, he does. He regrets his involvement in the slave trade, and he wrote Amazing Grace.
Did he become actively involved?
Yes, he did.
I think that you probably find that the reason for the difference in narration was that many of the slaves here were taught to read and write because they were household slaves, and it was useful to the owners to have them learn some of the, they have the ability to write, while in many of these other countries, they probably were not taught to write, so there wouldn't be any narrative.
Well, in the different colonies in what is nowadays U.S., it was forbidden to a slave to read and write. So it's curious that we do have these slave narratives when people did not, people could not, because people learn, but people could not read and write, and they had to hide this knowledge from the slave masters. In Brazil, in Cuba, in Peru, there was no prohibition, so people could learn how to read and write. In fact, it was a duty of the slave master to educate the slave. Of course, few people did that, if any, but still we don't have slave narratives.
So maybe there's a question, or maybe the fact that it was not allowed made them write it, maybe when they were left.
Most people who share the experience under enslavement they are talking with a missionary. So there is the involvement of another person writing down the memories. In some cases, not in the case of Equiano, he was able to write. So if you never read the slave narratives of Equiano, it's a beautiful, beautiful book. And it's amazing, his description of capture, enslavement, and the Middle Passage. Olauda Equiano, slave. Oh. Yes.
I think you mentioned that some slaves ended up in Portugal, but why didn't more slaves end up in other European countries?
There was a large slave population in London. There was also a large slave population in Lisbon, in different parts of Spain, in France. This is not a popular topic in Europe. So part of the problem that we don't know much about slavery in Europe is because we don't have people working on that. It doesn't mean that it didn't exist. It just means that people are not paying attention to these questions. People are not asking interesting questions about slavery. But in the recent years, there were interesting books published about African presence in England and also in Portugal. So we do know that there was a large African population, free and freed. There is a large number of free people living in different European cities. They maintain different religious groups. They are part of different churches. And you still have some of this influence, very strong, especially when you visit different churches in Europe. You can see angels with different faces. Do we have time? Yeah.
One fact that probably is not known for many people is that the first country in America and probably in the world that freed the slaves was Argentina. In 1813, Argentina decreed that any slaves that existed would be automatically free. Any slaves that were brought into the country as soon as they arrived to Argentina became free people. And the last one in America to free the slaves was Brazil.
Cuba. Now I have to defend my it's one of the few moments that I would defend Brazil, and I'm not proud of it. No, Brazil abolished slavery in well, it's true. I'm sorry. I apologize. You're completely right. Brazil abolished in 1888.
Yes.
So it
Brazil
is after
has
Cuba.
the largest population of African descent outside of Africa.
Yeah, after Nigeria. Yeah, it's the largest, is the country with the largest black population in the world after Nigeria. So it gives a sense of the importance of Africans in Brazilian history. But you're right, Brazil was the last one. So I cannot defend Brazil here.
End on that note.
Well, thank you so much.